This morning, the Voice of Catholic Tradition is pleased to broadcast an interview with Dr. Diane Moczar, based on her highly acclaimed book, 7 Lies About Catholic History. Dr. Moczar is an historian, college educator, and author of various books, including What Every Catholic Wants to Know, Catholic History, and 10 Dates Every Catholic Should Know. Host Joe Bagnoli and Dr. Moczar discuss various prevalent lies about Catholic history, including the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the Catholic Church's reputation of suppressing progress and science. Dr. Moczar, who is recognized for her thoroughly researched books and articles, gives factual information which debunks the fallacies and distortions of the Catholic Church in history. Please listen as Dr. Diane Moczar intelligently and expertly sheds the light of truth on these very important topics.
Good morning, Dr. Moczar.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Voice of Catholic Tradition on Long Island. It's a pleasure to have you with us this morning.
I'm very glad to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Moczar, your book, 7 Lies About Catholic History, Infamous Myths About the Church's Past and How to Answer Them, in its historical accuracy and thoroughness, should really put an end to an age of misrepresentation for the Catholic Church in each of the 7 areas you cover. But we know, and you make this quite clear in your book, that while the truth about the Catholic Church is finally becoming more widespread, it will not, at least not at this time, replace the barrage of myths, and you very clearly refer to them in your book as lies, that have become part of our media and our educational process, and we're speaking probably from the elementary level right up to postgraduate education. And before we get to each one, let me ask you this question first, as a sort of a set of framework for this interview. Where do you think these myths come from? And you're not afraid to refer to them as clearly as lies. And why are they being perpetuated, even though they cannot be supported by historical fact?
Well, where they come from, of course, is the father of lies. But as human agents, the enemies of the Church, I would just like to make one parenthesis here that I am not arguing with historical interpretation, because all historians do that. For example, on my dissertation, I had to deal with Pope Gregory IX and the Emperor Frederick II. Well, I found that some historians would interpret things in favor of the Pope, and other historians would, usually German historians, would interpret different happenings as showing in the Emperor's favor. So it's not interpretation. All historians do that. The other thing that I was just noticing when I was preparing for this program, and I was looking at the book, and in the back of the book where I give quite a few sources that I used, and most of them are not Catholic. They are merely historians that were trying to set the record right, that is, in correcting these lies, you see, and arguing against the lies. There are Protestant historians there are Jewish historians, and the only thing they're concerned about is historical truth. So they are on our side, you see. It's not really a question of interpretation. It's really confronting statements that are absolutely false. And we do get that, certainly. I give examples for each chapter, I think, in where what the origin of the particular lies is. And often, a lot of them came from the Protestant Reformation. A lot of them came from people who, liberals, who think the Inquisition must have been absolutely terrible because it censored certain speech, for what they call free speech. But like the Spanish Inquisition, the English hated that for political reasons because they hated Spain, as well as religious reasons. But the most recent work on that has been by an English historian who is not a Catholic, and he merely went in there and set the record straight and debunked all the lies about the Inquisition. So the lies usually are from people who aren't even historians. They merely want to use, they're looking for ammunition against things that Catholics have done in history. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So absolutely. So we are talking about a prejudice, an anti-church, anti-God prejudice that's supported by many.
Right.
Professors, textbooks, filmmakers, as you point out very clearly in your book, media figures, and unfortunately we have to say, and you do spend some time, unfortunately very poor catechesis in our own Catholic Church.
Oh, yes.
And this has been a contributing factor. So I wanted to set that straight, and I thank you for that explanation, because, you know, many times people say, well, we come to these interviews and we do these interviews with our own prejudice, you know, and I'm glad you set the record straight, and we can proceed from that. And I want to get to one of your what you call lie number one, and this one pertains to the Dark Ages, also known as the Middle Ages. And let me state in your book, so beautifully lays that you give the lie, and then you give your refutation, and you show where the lie came from, and then you go into historical fact. On the Dark Ages, defined in mythological terms as one long age of superstition and ignorance, relieved only by the advent of the Renaissance. And how would you respond to this particular point, which has become an institutional fact as far as history is concerned?
It certainly has, and actually it's interesting because it was Renaissance scholars first who came up with it. Even they were Catholics, but they decided that their era was so wonderful, and they themselves were so wonderful, that what came before was merely medieval,
right.
Middle Age. That is, it was between the glorious Roman and Greek civilization and their own glorious civilization, and they didn't want anything to do with the past that had come immediately before them. So this was a cultural thing. But then later on, of course, anti-Catholic scholars or historians or just people who wanted to find something to beat the Catholic Church with, they would go back to the works of these Renaissance scholars who disparaged the Middle Ages, and they would just repeat those lies. And they are lies, you know, because it's very easy to refute that. Those scholars made themselves ridiculous, you know, and I think they have been pretty well shot down by competent historians, but the word doesn't get out to the textbook authors.
No, and I can attest that in my own previous experience. And so what we have here is a situation that, in order to illuminate the historical significance of the Renaissance, it was vogue to just make the Middle Ages quite unproductive and insignificant.
Exactly, and I mean, and they were also, it's hard to see from their perspective. They were so enamored with their own architecture, for example, these Renaissance scholars, which Chesterton described as just as actually a dead thing because it just imitated Rome, the Roman dome and so forth. And they had all kinds of bad things to say to characterize the Gothic cathedrals, which really were a new thing. And, you know, there is nothing like them in history. And nobody thinks that way anymore. It's ridiculous to read what they have to say in, opposing the Gothic style. But then people, people who picked up on that, well, the Gothic style, yes, and what terrible buildings they were, but then look what went on in them, the Catholic Mass. Well, and then, that led the anti-Catholic people around to attacking the Catholic Church again.
So we were definitely dealing with a very healthy amount of anti-Catholicism all along here.
Yes.
Especially after the Protestant Reformation.
Yes.
And I think we can tie, if you take a look at the second point that you made in your book, because there's so much to discuss here, and I would have to simply say to people, you have to read this book. If you are looking for the education and the ability to respond to these lies, as you point out in your book, read the book. It's a tremendous foundation. One of the myths you referred to, and I think we can really dig our heels in here somewhat, the Catholic Church as the enemy of progress, and you state this lie. With the rise of Christianity, European culture and material progress in every field was retarded by religious opposition. Now, this is an absolutely absurd statement, but yet it is fact. And let's go through this one, for example, and I think we can tie in almost the previous lie. How do you respond to this charge?
Well, just with facts. I mean, in all of these, if you just go back and look at the facts, and this was so pervasive. It's part of the dark age thing, but because why were the ages so dark, according to these historians in the Middle Ages? Because they were dominated by the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church was rigidly opposed to any kind of illumination of the human intellect by science, and it was definitely anti-science. It was and everything intellectual, and any kind of progress. So it was really mostly the 19th century and the early 20th century when historians, again, they were not Catholic historians. I mean, Catholic historians knew this was crazy all along, and they were writing about it. But the ones that really got a hearing were the new medievalists who were able to get a better, more of hearing than Catholics would, just because they were, of the same background as the people promoting the lies. And they went in and looked into all of this, and there's obviously no argument there at all, because the Catholic Church was the one that pulled the world out of the Dark Ages by educating in the monasteries, by promoting the arts and sciences, by preserving the books in the monastic libraries, all the books, not just religious books, but copying even the secular books, and inventing the universities. That was something that was chartered by the popes, and you can go on and on. Science, the pioneers in the sciences were monks who were mostly doing research in the universities. So. I mean, Galileo was a Catholic, There's nobody that wasn't a Catholic in the history of science until quite recently.
Right. And that, just to splash ahead, one of you omits the science on trial, the Catholic Church versus Galileo, that you state one of the lies was that the Church has routinely suppressed science and presented scientists and persecuted them, proving that its religious doctrines are incompatible with reason and empirical knowledge. And you just spelled it out. And we could go on in that area with how the Catholic Church was entrenched in science. And you refer to here the educational process. One of the criticisms is, well, yeah, they were heavily embedded in theology, and that's just not true. We're talking law, medicine, grammar, logic, rhetoric, math, science, astronomy. And yet this lie about the darkness of the Middle Ages and the lack of intellectual progress just continues on.
Yes. Well, obviously there are people who have never read Thomas Aquinas, on the division and method of the sciences, and he's using science in the broad sense that includes philosophy and the other intellectual disciplines. But, there's no question if you just read any of the great minds of the Middle Ages, like St. Thomas's teacher, St. Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, and he was the first botanist since classical times. You can't get away from that. But really, the people writing the textbooks are all modernists. They're trained in modern universities. They have not studied the Middle Ages in any depth, and they think. Let me just give one example. Dr. Walsh, who in the early 20th century, who wrote is a doctor, and he had written some excellent works on the Middle Ages, and in one of them, he discussed the hospitals and the level of nursing care and medical care in the Middle Ages, and he showed how enlightened it was. He said that we have this thing, like in the care of mental patients. He said, and he was writing in the early 20th century when mental patients were horribly treated. In this country, they called them snake pits.
Yes.
And put these people away in these horrible institutions. He said, we think because things were so bad in our country just a few years ago from when he was writing, He said, we think that the further back we go in history, the worse things must have been, because our view of progress is that it can only go, in a straight line to us, and we're taking it further. We're the progressives. So we think that if things were bad in the early 20th century in medicine, they must have been that much worse in the Middle Ages, whereas the opposite was true. So there is this cult of progress. Do you see? Am I making sense there?
Absolutely.
That interferes with the way people see history, period. They think that what went on in the past must have been worse than what we have now because we are so wonderful now. And, we can't imagine not having television or something.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
What did people do?
Yeah, it is a cult of progress that interferes with seeing history as anything but linear.
Yes. And if you look back, the point is very, very well taken. Look at the guilds at this time period. Look at the social responsibility they had. They basically brought organization to government in order to replace a system, talk about it, was a feudal system, which was so outdated. I mean, it had served its purpose at the time, the result of chaos.
Right.
But out of chaos came the guilds, which helped bring, actually the model for town governments for the future.
Oh, yes. No, that's exactly.
And then you have the Catholic monarchy. I'd like to spend a little time on this, which, look at those Catholic monarchs. They were so embedded in religion and theology, and it was their way or no way. But your book so clearly explains the role of, well, like you say, everyone was Catholic before the Protestant Reformation. But the monarchy came out of necessity, with the fall of Charlemagne, which led to the feudal system. Then after the feudal system, we came, through this period of growth, the monarchy system developed, and out of necessity. And how would you explain that?
Well, I think St. Thomas and the other political thinkers of the Catholic Church have discussed the different types of government, and Aristotle also. And they all concluded that it was much better to have one man in charge than a lot of people, because it's easier to find one good man, one virtuous man, than it is to find a lot of men.
Oh, we're finding that out.
Yeah, well, yes. So the idea is that there should be one man who was competent in charge of the big stuff, but he should delegate at a level below himself to other people who would take over parts of the government and under his general umbrella. And then down at the local level, you had people running their own affairs in a way that we can't even imagine now. The way town governments were really independent. They were not oppressed by the central government or anything like that. And that was I'm talking about in the Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. So there was a hierarchy of government, and responsibility was delegated. But the king had the final say, and he was at the top. And he had to govern according not only to the laws of his country, but to the laws of God. So he was responsible before God for what he was doing.
Yes,
and he was very conscious of that.
Oh, yeah, and it's not to say that there weren't instances of friction between the church and the state, but as you point out in your book, but the greater examples of cooperation and progress for the common good far outnumber.
Oh, right. Oh, sure.
The problems that might have existed. And the Catholic Church, you can't disprove this. The Catholic Church helped create the civilization of the West, and it played the leading role. And there's no history other than opinion, prejudiced opinion, which could dispute this. And now we talk about the Crusades, one of the other, talk about something that really has taken a beating. They received more than their fair share of negative scrutiny. And as you list this lie in your book, that the Crusades were medieval crimes against humanity, a prime example of destructive religious zealotry.
Right.
And in your book, you insist that the Crusades are now being evaluated by the presentation of total revisionist history.
Yeah.
That there's a total distortion of fact, and maybe give a little clarification of this.
Yes, well, actually, there has been a lot of rethinking of the Crusades. I mean, there's Rodney Stark, who writes about the Crusades, and he's not a Catholic scholar, but he does a terrific job. I mean, what was his book? God's Battalions. And he defends the Crusades, and that came out just a couple of years ago. So, and there have been other books that have come out defending the Crusades, because it's obvious that they were not what their critics said once you look at the documents and the facts. And the other thing that is often overlooked is that Islam really was a tremendous threat. I mean, it was threatening the whole Middle East, and it would go on because the Crusades did eventually fizzle out, and there was no more support from them from Europe. The Muslims, especially with the Ottoman Turks, did go on then to take over the whole Eastern Empire, go into the Balkans, commit the worst atrocities, and into Eastern Europe and Hungary, and so it's hard to blame them when you see what resulted because they weren't able to hold on.
That's quite clear, and you spell out some of the specific accusations of cruelty and the taking of Jerusalem. I mean, there are so many things that you spell out, and you present the historical fact and the circumstances around
right.
it, and we'd have to spend again another whole program on that. But a lot of this is post-Reformation nonsense, I would say. You make reference to the Protestant Reformation. To give validity to the Reformation, the best thing you could do is to destroy the Catholic Church.
That's right.
And this one seemed to be, this is one of the. It's not surprising that most falsehoods come out of the post-Reformation England.
Oh, yes. The English were very good at that.
They were champions of this, and I would recommend to our listening audience that when you get into that chapter on the Crusades, you'll find out that the threat was greater than that we could imagine. And you have in your book you refer to many present-day leaders in the Catholic Church who are apologizing with every opportunity they can get.
Oh, right and left, I know. And I think I have President Clinton.
Yes, you do have President Clinton in there. Yeah, as a matter of fact, he was at Georgetown. And I'll give a little quote here. Those of us who come from various European lineages are not blameless. Indeed, in the First Crusade, when the Christian soldiers took Jerusalem, they first burned a synagogue with 300 Jews in it and proceeded to kill every woman and child who was Muslim on a Temple Mount. And on. I could keep reading, and again, when you have
evidence for any of that. I mean, none of it is true. Yeah.
Right. And I don't want to sound like a salesman, but to find out the truth, buy your book. Read the book, and you'll find out the truth here. But when you have modern day people who are held up somewhat, if you hold up Mr. Clinton in high esteem, these people who are held up in high esteem, you believe, well, if they say it, it's the big lie theory. You say it enough. Someone's going to believe.
Popes. I mean, we have these modern popes that have been they apologize for absolutely everything, and they're absolutely wrong. I mean, it's like, was it Paul VI who gave the great Battle of Lepanto, the great sea battle of Lepanto, in which Christendom defeated the Ottoman Turkish fleet in 1571, and that was through the intervention of Our Lady and everything, and that's one of our the things we can be most proud of in our history. Well,
absolutely.
He gave back the standard of the flagship of Lepanto to the Ottoman Turks.
Yes.
Or the standard, maybe it was their standard that had been captured. Yeah,
yes.
Sorry, that must have been what it was. And so instead of that being a symbol of of the great victory against oppression, he took it back to them as a gesture of goodwill. but they didn't want it because it was a symbol of their humiliation.
Yeah,
so they just left it moldering on the, on the hay there.
But it's feel-goodism all over the place.
Exactly.
And when you have these individuals who are prominent, well, the truth just becomes more truthful then, and that's all there is to it. And there's one of your myths, for example, that the fourth one you referred to about the Inquisition. Now, everyone has a field day with this one.
Yes.
And the lie that you state quite clearly that for centuries the Catholic Church sponsored the persecution, torture, and death of thousands, perhaps millions of innocent people. Now, here we go again. Now, besides, again, historical inaccuracy, you show how the Inquisition is being interpreted, and I like the way you did it, in a modern world well outside of the framework of that time period. And I think that's very important when you read that chapter. The way you presented it, the lies came from the Reformation and the Enlightenment periods of the 16th and 18th century. So these were being developed. And there's one thing that I'd like to just ask you quickly, because I'm looking at our clock here, and we obviously are not going to be able to get to all of them. So I'm going to invite you back right now for a second interview. So we can complete this. But quite clearly, you mentioned the seriousness of heresy at that time was taken as anyone would consider a serious crime today in our culture.
Exactly.
And could you explain that to our listening audience?
Well, yes. If you have a really Catholic society, and all your social justice principles, your political principles, all your organization and everything is organized according to the principles of Christian living. And some heretic comes in and starts saying that, like the Cathars, that marriage is no good, and people should make themselves perfect and then starve themselves to death, and the clergy is so corrupt that there shouldn't be any clergy, this kind of thing. Well, obviously, that is a great threat both to church and state, because these heretics are undermining, they're taking souls to hell, or, if they don't repent, the souls don't repent. And they are also undermining the political order, because often the heretics were also political revolutionaries. I mean, there are lots of examples of that. So it was only normal for church and state. I mean, look at the, when communism, there was we overreacted and thought there was more of it in this country than there actually was. But certainly the country was quite right to be watching out for that, and they went after them. And they did get a lot of communists, a number of communists anyway, in the period following World War II. Well, now everybody looks back and says, oh, wasn't that terrible that we persecuted those nice writers and so forth just for being communists? Well, that's the same kind of thing. But what if we hadn't,
Mm-hmm.
So,
exactly.
I think that if something is definitely a danger to the social and political and religious order, then I don't see how you can possibly quarrel with getting rid of it. And they didn't just go out there and bump them off; they tried to convert them,
right?
And or expel them. All right, if you don't want to convert, well, just at least leave. But if they were insisted on staying and subverting souls, well, that was their lookout.
And you point out clearly that this was a threat also to the state, and it's not just a religious threat. They weren't.
Exactly.
This was not about not believing in the Catholic faith. This was about opposition in terms of heresy and defying the state.
Yes.
Which was also very, very important.
Yes, that is true. It was not soft police like under communism.
No, and
you could
again,
think what you wanted, but if you went out and tried to persuade other people to join your crazy sect, well, then the state would say, well, you're disrupting the social order, and then therefore we would ask you to stop. That makes so much sense to me that it's hard to see why nobody would see that. Yeah.
And you define it clearly as a process. While some of it might not be desirable, that was the norm for the day and for previous historical periods, going back into the Romans and into the Greeks also. So, and we're looking at it from our perspective here, and not that you're condoning it, but you laid out in that chapter a clarification that's very important. And Dr. Moczar, I'd love to go on here, but we're going to have to, I see the clock has caught up with us.
Okay.
And we can continue this, but I would like to say that I thank you for giving us your time this morning and sharing in your research, and obviously you've done quite a bit of research, to find the truth about the Catholic Church's place in history. And I highly recommend, if you want the truth, and I go out to our listening audience, please, you want to replace that revisionist history that's all over the place, please read Dr. Diane Moczar's book, 7 Lies About Catholic History, available through TAM Books and the Angelus Press, and I'm sure you go online, you'll find it all over. And our commentator, our announcer, will give you more information on the writings of Dr. Moczar. Dr. Moczar.
The Voice of Catholic Tradition is most pleased to broadcast a second interview with Dr. Diane Moczar, which is a continuation of a discussion regarding her acclaimed book, 7 Lies About Catholic History. Dr. Moczar, a respected educator and trusted historian, explains how revisionist accounts of historical events have distorted Catholic history for both non-Catholics and Catholics alike. Some of the topics discussed on today's program are the Protestant Reformation, early Catholic explorers and conquerors in the New World, and the Church's true position regarding Galileo and his scientific theories. Please listen to Dr. Moczar's interview with host Joe Bagnoli, which reveals the Catholic Church's authentic and fascinating history.
Good morning, Dr. Moczar. Welcome back to the Voice of Catholic Tradition.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here again.
Thank you very much. Dr. Moczar, not too long ago, in an earlier interview that we did, we began to examine your book titled 7 Lies About the Catholic History, Infamous Myths About the Church's Past and How to Answer Them. And I would say that for everyone out there, this is a must-read, Catholic and non-Catholics. We discussed the lies about the Dark Ages in part 1 of this interview, the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the Catholic Church being the enemy of progress. And that was done very thoroughly. But before we did this, you had made a very important point that created a foundation for your book. And that point is that you are not questioning the reality of historical interpretation, but rather you are dismissing what you consider what are historical lies. And could you explain that briefly to our listening audience this morning?
Well, yes, I was just thinking of an interesting example. For example, the way the English look at the American Revolution and we look at the American Revolution, or the War of Liberation, or whatever we're going to call it. And it's quite interesting because when I teach that in my college classes, I have the students choose sides, and they're either Tories or they are patriots, the revolutionaries. And the different angles that you get, it's not that the facts are any different, because the same, both sides would accept that the same things had happened, but they see them from a different, they have, according to whatever values they have, political or social or nationalistic values, they would judge that event differently. I was thinking that that's exactly what we do in history, and so interpretation is fine, or taking a position. But the idea that facts would be falsified, that is what I'm attacking in my book.
I see. And we can then approach this discussion from that perspective. You made that very clear. And let's take a look at one lie which particularly interests me in the way it's been presented. It concerns the Protestant Reformation, or I like to refer to it as a revolution. You call this lie, you entitled it, "The Church Corrupted to the Core." And you stated that the lie reads as such: the Protestant Reformation was necessary, since the Catholic Church had become utterly corrupted by immorality and false doctrine. And that's basically what's out there. And let's just take that in the general perspective. We can break it down as we move along. What would be your response to this, Dr. Moczar?
Well, that's a very interesting one, because actually, it could be that some people who did attack the church on those grounds did it on the basis of something, some limited information. I mean, let us say that some heretic at the time happened to know that there was a monastery that where the monks were leading worldly lives. I mean, sure, those things happened in all ages, or they were not living according to the rule or something. And then he proceeded to generalize and use that as a weapon against the church, that all the monasteries are corrupt, all the monks are hypocrites, and so forth. That's one instance. But what I think they really wanted to get at was not really the morals of the church. They did use that to smear the church entirely. I mean, the whole church they accused of having corrupt morals. But what they really wanted to get at was doctrine. And they wanted to attack the doctrine of the church because they had come up with their own doctrine, which were new ideas that had never been taught in the church. So to justify that, they proceeded to attack the church on any front that they could.
So we're talking basically then under the guise of using probably what were legitimate complaints, grievances about certain behaviors, doing it from a single perspective. They turned that into a general interpretation of what the Catholic Church was at the time. That would be like examining the behavior of soldiers on one side of the war and not examining the behavior of the soldiers on the other side.
Well, that's true, and also generalizing and saying, well, all those soldiers on that side were that way, which is not true. Obviously, it's not true. You know, the more recent research and writing on the so-called corruption of the churches said that there just is no fire where there was supposed to be that smoke. So, I mean, except in a few, isolated cases, such as have always existed.
Now, those were very difficult years for the Catholic Church, and in your book, you spell out some of the difficulties that existed prior to the Reformation. For some 2 centuries, at least, you're quite specific about that. And you mention the 100 Years' War, the famine from climate change has had a terrible impact on the European population, the Black Death. Could you discuss some of these things with us, Doctor?
Well, yeah. I mean, because the church is made up of human beings, people, and they live in their own time. And especially in the church suffered quite a bit, as all of Europe did, with the climate change of the 14th century, of the early 14th century, and the famines that ensued, and then the Black Death, which wiped out a large percentage of the population of Europe, and in fact spread over to Asia too. We don't have the figures for that, but it was devastating. So whole monasteries and whole convents would be wiped out, and it seems that during the worst of the famine, of the plague, when nursing was badly needed and so forth, the good religious, the dedicated ones, would be out there nursing the sick, and they would get the plague and they would die too. The ones that were not so good and were only looking after their own skins, they would not go out into the streets, but they would in fact head for the hills and the mountains and try to go to some area where the plague had not got yet. And then when it had subsided, then those were the ones that came back and took up the job of the clergy or the monasteries or whatever. So it seems that there was a definite lowering of quality as the result of the Black Death. But that wasn't everywhere. Even the Black Death didn't devastate every single region in Europe. So there is something to be said for that it did certainly lower the quality of the clergy.
Right. So, and therefore, looking at emphasizing the weaknesses in human behavior at that time, especially on the part of the clergy, a generalization was made that does not recognize those who sacrificed in the monasteries and in healthcare. And that seems to have just brought on a life of its own. Because if you read about in William Cobbett's book, The Protestant Reformation in England and Ireland, I mean, he as a non-Catholic, he is so descriptive. He cannot stop writing about the benefits of the monastic system.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, even with that, I would say, somewhat slight lowering of the standards of the clergy and so forth, I mean, the institutions still worked as they had always done. Yeah, definitely.
Right, and without those institutions, there would have been chaos. And in many cases, and specifically in the Reformation in England, there was chaos after Henry VIII went crazy between Cromwell and Cranmer.
Yeah.
All nonsense broke loose, and England would never be the same again.
That's right. Oh, exactly. Yes, I mean the way they abolished the guilds. I mean institutions that had supported the worker and provided social services and so forth. I mean all through the century, the Black Death didn't stop stuff like that, or the hospitals, or the insane asylums, or the orphanages, or anything. It took somebody like Henry VIII to wipe all that out when he wiped out the church. Yeah.
So, and the bottom line here is, the way I see it, is that if you take the negative facts that have been driven on their own, let's say, through revisionist history, these facts are basically what Protestants did believe and still do believe as a rationalization for creating, and you pointed out in your book, and continuing to create. They have over 33,000 different Protestant sects now.
And each one is supposed to be the true one. Yes.
Yes, the latest truth.
That's right. That's right.
So and you have that, and if you and we are not here, we are not at all ridiculing anyone in terms of what they believe in. Naturally, we believe we have the true faith, but we're talking about a historical reference here,
right?
And that's how we're examining it. And you go on to say also, and I think this is very worth discussing, because you had mentioned earlier in our first interview how the Catholic Church, and unfortunately recent popes have gone out of their way to apologize.
Oh, heavens, yes.
For and that could be another program that we could do.
Papal apologies, yeah.
Yeah, papal apologies. And they've gone out of their way to apologize for so many things in the Catholic past. And now you put that together with the, as you point out again, the genuinely negative, or very poor, let's put it this way, very poor Catholic catechesis since the 1960s. Now you have everyone, even Catholics, believing, and I've been in conversations with Catholics, and I'm sure you have too, that they say, well, look at the Church's history, it has a lot to be ashamed of.
You know, exactly. You do hear that all the time. And it's because they have never, as you say, they have just not been taught. I mean, we weren't getting, well, yes, I was going to say we weren't getting good history even before the Vatican II, but I don't think that's true. I think that when I go back and look at some of the old Catholic history books that were used in Catholic high schools and even grade schools, they're far superior to anything we get now. I mean, everything we get now is sociological or something, or has some other slant that is not giving them the real history of their church that they can be proud of.
No, absolutely not.
Fact, yeah.
And not only history, but I'm sad to say some theology too that is not approved by the Catholic Church, and it's in some of the Catholic religion books.
Oh, I know. Yeah, no, that is really a scandal. Oh. Yes, in fact, I don't want to get off the track here, but I was asked to write and I won't identify the publisher or anything, but I was asked to write a high school religion book that was supposed to, I forget how many different components it had and all that, and it was supposed to be about history, the history of the liturgy or something like that. But, they when I started submitting samples, they began to say, well, that was I think I mentioned, I quoted in one of the early church fathers saying that it was a good idea to go to confession before receiving Holy Communion, especially if you were in the state of sin. But the editors did turn that down because they said, well, that's negative. That's not welcoming enough. That's not encouraging the people to receive the students to receive the Eucharist or something. That's totally crackpot. It doesn't matter whether you're in a state of sin or not. I mean, anyway, I did not take the contract.
But you know, you're not off the topic, because there's still a reformation of some sort going on.
Oh, there is. Yeah.
I mean, so
in the crazy book world. Yeah.
Yes, and it is all part of, in many ways, leaning towards not making the Catholic faith objectionable to other religions.
That's it. That's right. Yes.
And I have seen very recently an act of contrition that did not include the word confess my sins.
Seriously?
It was not there. So I don't know how many different forms of the act of contrition are out there, but the one I saw did not include it. So maybe we are getting off briefly, but I think it's well worth it, because I think this is all part of it, and so much of what drives the church today has to do with reconciliation.
Right.
Which is based on going back and looking at the Protestant Reformation and reevaluating everything.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that, and I'm glad we spent some time on this. And I believe in this is an extremely important topic. Well, we have others here. Another one that really I find talk about history from the British perspective as taught by Americans.
Yeah.
Right? You talk about one lie. You label it a black and expedient legend, and the lie is this: the Spanish explorers of the New World were cruel and greedy. Naturally, the Spanish being Catholic, carrying out the orders of the Catholic masters and bringing untold misery to the peaceful American Indians.
Right.
And that no one could debate. I mean, if you take a look at the history books today, I've seen enough of them myself in my own career. There is no doubt that this is the way it is being presented. This lie has become so historically factualized that it fills our history texts, and to refuse to accept it would be the same as saying that night does not follow day. That's how concrete this is.
Yeah.
And let's go over some of the facts here. Let's take a look at the English treatment of, let us say, native populations versus the Spanish and the French. And you do that beautifully in your book. What are the facts here, Dr. Moczar?
Oh, my goodness, it was genocide.
Oh, yeah.
There's in one word. When you look at the total decimation of the North American Indian tribes by the British and the Americans, and even how when the Puritans first came to New England, and the way they treated the Indians. I mean, the Indians were trying to be friendly with them, and then but they considered them, they were Calvinists, so they considered them the unsaved. And when the poor Indians got a plague or something from or smallpox, and they were dying, and they were burning the corpses nearby, and I think I quoted one of the Puritan elders of saying, it was a sort of sweet aroma of incense to God that all those wretched, lost people were depraved, whatever they were dying, to make way for a better race, because that's what they thought. They were racist too. That we find racism, certainly.
Oh, absolutely.
Among the English Protestants. So there is no comparison when you look at the record of the Spanish, and I don't mean just the conquistadors, who were a fairly small number, but when with them right away came the religious orders and the setting up of schools and hospitals and orphanages and all those things, and the teaching of even Cortez, I think it was, who set up the first printing press. I could be wrong about that. In Mexico, to print books in the Nahuatl language for the Aztecs. So even even the conquerors themselves were anxious to do things for those people and bring them to, into Spanish culture and Catholic culture and all that.
Yes, of course.
You don't see that in the Protestants in New England or anything like that.
No, you don't see that in North America, especially in the East Coast and in New England area. But if you to examine, and let's spend a little time on, let's say, Cortez, and in general the Spanish, generally it's interpreted as they were here for one reason, to eliminate an inferior population and force a new religious belief upon them.
Yeah.
That's what basically dominates most of your textbooks today.
Right.
And naturally they mentioned the wealth of the New World and how much of it had to go back and all of that. Not that, very little reference to the English desire for wealth in the New World.
That's right.
No, we don't talk about that, but we'll talk about the Spanish and the French running after all of the furry animals up in Canada. But we do have, let's take a look at Cortez. Now, Cortez, when he got here, there are a few things your book points out. He saw a horror of human sacrifice that was unparalleled.
That's right.
And he did quite successfully overcome this. Yeah. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, they must have been brutal in their approach because they were really outnumbered, and why weren't they subdued by the native population? But your book points out, and historically this is true, that Cortez was supported by a large number of local natives.
Oh, yeah, tens of thousands who had been brutalized by the Aztecs.
Yeah, can you explain how that played the role in this?
Yeah, well, they were the ones that actually made the conquest, because as soon as he landed on the Atlantic coast, he was joined by all these tribes that were totally disaffected because the Aztecs, for some 100 years or more, had been rounding them up and using them for human sacrifices. I mean, their bloodthirsty gods just couldn't get enough of human sacrifice. And it was not just in the capital city, it was in the different Aztec cities in what is now Mexico. So they knew that they were, in great danger, and their children, too, of being victims of these devil gods. And they were looking to the Spaniards or to anybody who would release them, give them some relief from these oppressive people. And so they joined them.
So would you say that fact has been ignored in our history texts?
Yes, I think so. It isn't that there aren't quite a few fairly new books out there that have this in graphic detail. But I think in general, the mainstream idea is, once you plant a lie, the trouble is that people don't bother to check it. And if they hear it once when they're young or just read it someplace, then it sticks in their mind, and they don't go and do anything, any research to see if it might be true. So I think most people, if you just ask them, what is your impression of the Spanish in coming to the New World or something like that? I think you'd get the lie.
Yes.
In most cases, yeah.
Yeah, I think you would. And Pope Paul II in 1537 quoted quite clearly, Indians should not be treated like animals. They should not be deprived of their freedom or their possessions as though just because they are not Christians. And this this was coming from the Pope. And naturally we have the wonderful miracle of Juan Diego, the Lady of Guadalupe,
right.
barely 10, 12 years later, which led to mass conversion of millions.
Yeah, something like 7 million Aztecs. Yeah.
Yes.
I just revisited this because I have a book coming out in the spring called, I think it's Converts and Kingdoms or something, about the conversion, how the church converted the pagan world, and from the beginning, the different countries of Europe, but then I also include Spanish America. And so I had to revisit it again, and I did a lot more research, and I mean, it's a fantastic record, of the conquistadors and then the missionaries who came with them, and how that, that the brutal cultures in so many places were wiped out.
Yes, and I've even read recently how there have been many accusations that the miracle of Guadalupe was a created miracle, just being used as an excuse.
Oh no, really?
Oh yes, I've read that in a couple of places that was set aside. It was necessary to help get the native population to think along Catholic lines.
Oh goodness, I never came across that.
Yes, and I say, boy, that's really going out on a limb here. But
wow.
All of it's out there, and just because you read it doesn't mean it's dominant. But there's so much between the internet and the book, you don't know which is true and which is not.
Well,
but that's part of the problem. But I'm glad we had a chance to discuss this, because we are not so much pointing finger at the English, even though you did clarify their attitude. but at least let's clarify what was not true when it came to the Spanish.
Well, exactly. And the French, I must say, I didn't deal with them, but the French in French Canada, I mean, they were setting up schools for Indian girls and sending nuns over, and I mean, they did a tremendous amount for the natives, as the Spanish did. But just in between there, you got the English doing nothing, you know.
Right.
So, I mean, there were no colleges for Indians.
No, I don't. I don't think so. Well, our final point here, Dr. Moczar, if we can squeeze this in, we have a little time left here. The lie about Galileo.
Yes.
And that's one of the biggies. But they call your book entitled "The Science on Trial: The Catholic Church versus Galileo," and you state the lie as such: the Church has routinely suppressed science and persecuted scientists, proving that its religious doctrines are incompatible with reason and empirical knowledge. Now, you state that this legend about Galileo was not created until the 1760s in order to discredit the Church. Could you explain this?
Yes, it's an interesting time lag there because I don't know that anybody at the time of people took sides, you know, and friends of Galileo and people on the other side. And really, it was not a question of heliocentrism at all. I mean, it was what got Galileo in trouble was that he ended up he was so determined to push his point of view that he started interpreting Scripture in a way that would support his heliocentrism. That was one thing.
That's the idea that the sun is the center of our planetary system.
That's right.
The heliocentric theory.
Exactly, yes. And then he was when he was told to just shut up and be quiet for a while, instead he went out and made friends who would give him a podium, and he would go and speak all over the place. And he really was upsetting a lot of people, I mean, ordinary people, who then thought that, you know, there must be the church must have been teaching the wrong thing or something. So I think the church was absolutely right, and in fact I have read some secular authors who have said exactly the same thing. The church was absolutely right in this case to ask him to pipe down. He had no proof for his theory. The proof was not come by until I don't know when, because when I asked scientists, when was heliocentrism proven, demonstrated? And I don't know that it ever actually was. It seems to work, but then the geocentrism seems to work for navigation. So, I mean, I am not a scientist, you see. But the whole thing is totally distorted to think that the church was trying to suppress science when it was merely trying to deal with a sort of loose cannon who would not take any kind of restrictions on what he could say or do, even if it was upsetting people's faith.
Well, the church was dealing with a reality at that time, and to claim and to take that situation, even though it was not correct, and to say that was the nature of the church in general, we have historical fact upon fact that shows that, if anything, the church was a champion of scientific research.
Oh, but they even, there were churchmen who were quite willing to think that heliocentrism was probably true, because it was, who was it? Who was the one that Galileo got it?
Copernicus?
Copernicus, yeah, and Copernicus was a cleric, and his book was published with an imprimatur and everything. So there was they were willing to say, yeah, it's very likely true, but it has not been proven.
Right.
And what Galileo was doing was saying, I have proved it. And then he began to cite Scripture to prove it.
Right.
And so this is what really got him in trouble.
So,
because if it was definitely proven, then they would have had to go back carefully and re-examine those passages in Scripture where it seems that it says that the sun stood still, you know.
Right.
This is not a trivial question. This is a question of the inerrancy of Scripture. How are you going to interpret that if, in fact, the sun moved? Now, they could have, all they wanted to do was stop preaching about it at the popular level and let the scientists figure it out and the theologians hash it out.
Right.
Galileo wouldn't do that.
No, so he wasn't he wasn't the hall before the dreaded Inquisition, arrested, tortured, and humiliated. In your book, if I could just about end our program on this, you say by the time the trial occurred, I'm quoting, Galileo was in his 70s and not in the best of health. He was never tortured or in fear of torture. He was never truly imprisoned. His food was and wine were provided by the embassy. There was no huge courtroom full of enemies of the accused, and those present were Galileo, 2 officials, and the secretary. And the
four people.
That's it. And the report of the officials was then submitted to a tribunal of 10 cardinals. Quite obviously, yes, he did recant. He did sign a retraction and was sentenced to imprisonment. But you say it was the foregone.
He was just to go home and stay in his house.
Yes, that's what your book clearly explains. But they called it an imprisonment.
Yeah, no.
So hopefully we're running out of time here, but hopefully we've set that one to rest too. But Dr. Moczar, there's so much more I'd like to discuss here, but we just don't have the time. And it's really been wonderful talking to you. And I say to our listening audience once again, if you want the truth, buy the book. If you want to place revisionist history aside and read Dr. Diane Moczar's book, 7 Lies About Catholic History. It's available through TAN, Angelus Press, on Amazon. And for those interested in part 1 of the interview, go to voiceofcatholicradio.com. Go to our archives on the menu, click 2011 and number 48, and you'll hear part 1 of this. Dr. Moczar, thank you very much for coming aboard this morning.
Thank you very much.
God bless you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Once again, the Voice of Catholic Tradition thanks Dr. Moczar for taking valuable time from her busy schedule. We encourage our listeners to be educated in the light of truth by reading her well-researched and documented books, among them 7 Lies About Catholic History and 10 Dates Every Catholic Should Know. She is currently working on 2 new books, The Catholic Church Under Attack and Converts and Kingdoms, How the Church Converted the Pagan West and How We Could Do It Again. We look forward to future interviews with Dr. Moczar on these very important topics.